There is a name that some people carry without ever knowing what it once meant. A name that, 1,000 years ago, could open the gates of a palace. Today it sits quietly on a passport, a mailbox, a gravestone in a village most tourists never visit. And the strange thing is this: the person carrying it usually has no idea. For centuries, we have been told that empires end, that they crumble into ruins, get swallowed by textbooks, and become names we memorize for exams. Byzantium fell in 1453. Constantinople became Istanbul. The purple-born emperors, the silk-robe dynasties, the marble halls of the Bucolian palace, gone, we assumed, into dust. Except they didn't entirely vanish. Some of them simply changed address. Scattered across Greece, southern Italy, the Balkans, and even parts of Russia and Western Europe, there are families whose surnames trace directly back to the ruling houses of the Byzantine Empire. Not symbolically, not romantically, genealogically. And in recent years, historians and genetic researchers have begun asking an uncomfortable, fascinating question. How many ordinary people today are, in some measurable sense, descendants of an empire we were taught no longer exists? This is not a myth-making exercise. It is a slow, careful reconstruction, part archive, part DNA, part detective work. And what it suggests is that the fall of Byzantium was not the end of a bloodline. It was a scattering. For most of modern history, the accepted narrative was simple. Byzantium fell. Its aristocracy either died in the siege of Constantinople, converted and assimilated into Ottoman administration, or fled west with whatever gold and manuscripts they could carry. Historians spoke of the last Byzantines as if they were a closing chapter, a people who existed and then, quite suddenly, did not. The surviving noble families were treated as historical footnotes, mentioned once in a chronicle, then absorbed into the general population of the Mediterranean world. Names like Paleologos, Komnenos, and Angelos appeared in history books attached to emperors, and then seemed to disappear from the record entirely once the empire did. It made sense on the surface. Empires end. Bloodlines dilute. After 5, 10, 20 generations, does an imperial surname really mean anything at all? But that is where the first crack appeared. Genealogists working through Venetian archives, Ottoman tax registers, and Orthodox church records in the 19th and 20th centuries began noticing something odd. These surnames had not disappeared. They had migrated, quietly, stubbornly, into villages in the Peloponnese, into Corsica, into southern Italy, into the Russian nobility, and even into the merchant families of Trebizond long after the empire's capital had fallen. The names were not symbolic borrowings, either. In several documented cases, the families could trace direct, unbroken descent through baptismal and marriage records back to identifiable Byzantine noble houses. This was not folklore. This was paperwork. And paperwork, unlike memory, is difficult to argue with. That is where the science enters the story. Modern genealogists no longer rely solely on parish registers and church ledgers. They now cross-reference documented lineages with Y-chromosome DNA, which passes largely unchanged from father to son, and with autosomal DNA testing, which reveals broader ancestral mixing across a family tree. For surname-based lineages, where a name has historically followed the paternal line, Y-DNA testing has become a particularly powerful tool. It does not tell you everything, but it tells you whether the men carrying a surname today share a common paternal ancestor deep enough in time to plausibly connect to a documented historical figure. Researchers began testing men who carried names historically associated with Byzantine aristocracy, some from Greece, some from Italy, some from diaspora communities in the United States and Australia. What they found did not simply confirm the old assumption that these are just old Greek names now common in the population. Instead, in several family lines, they found something researchers had not fully expected: genetic markers consistent with deep paternal continuity, stretching back further than could be explained by coincidence or common regional ancestry alone. That was not proof of imperial descent in every case. But it was a signal. And once you see a signal like that, you cannot simply look away. If stories like this interest you, the kind where genealogy, science, and forgotten empires collide, consider subscribing, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most family trees admit. So which names are we actually talking about? Palaiologos is the name everyone expects first, and for good reason. It belonged to the final ruling dynasty of Byzantium, the family of Constantine XI, who died defending Constantinople's walls in 1453. Descendants of Palaiologos-linked families have been documented in Italy, particularly around Pesaro, and in parts of Greece, where the surname survives in modified forms to this day. Komnenos carries almost as much weight. This was the dynasty that briefly revived Byzantine power in the 12th century under Alexios I, and its descendants split in fascinating directions. Some remained in Constantinople, others founded the separate empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, a smaller Byzantine successor state that lingered for another 8 years after the capital fell. Angelos, the name behind the dynasty that ruled during one of Byzantium's more turbulent centuries, still appears today, sometimes anglicized simply as Angelo or Angelou. Doukas, an old and powerful aristocratic house predating even the Komnenoi, produced multiple emperors and left descendants across the Aegean. Cantacuzzinos is one of the more strikingly preserved names. The family produced Emperor John VI in the 14th century, and its descendants can be documented in Romania and Russia, where branches of the family became part of the Eastern European nobility long after Byzantium itself had fallen. Lascaris belonged to the dynasty that governed the Empire of Nicaea, the Byzantine government in exile that held the line during the decades when Constantinople itself was under Latin Crusader occupation. Some genealogists connect surviving Lascaris lines to families in Italy and the Greek islands. Vatatzes, tied to Emperor John III, remembered even by later generations as an unusually just ruler, left descendants whose name persists in Cyprus and parts of the Greek mainland. Raoul, despite sounding distinctly Western European, entered Byzantine aristocracy through a Norman knight who married into the imperial elite, and the family became thoroughly Hellenized within a generation, illustrating how porous the boundary between Byzantine and foreign bloodlines truly was. Branas, an old military aristocratic family, appears in records connected to both Byzantine generals and later Venetian-administered territories. Choniates is remembered less for ruling and more for chronicling. The historian Nicetas Choniates left behind one of the most detailed surviving accounts of Constantinople's fall, and descendants of his family are documented in later Greek intellectual and clerical circles. Phocas belonged to a powerful military dynasty that produced emperors and generals centuries before the Palaiologoi even existed, and traces of the name persist, sometimes transformed, in Cyprus and Crete. Argyros, meaning silver, marked another aristocratic military line, and modern surnames like Argyros or Argyripolis in Greece and the Greek diaspora are sometimes, though not always, connected to this older lineage. Diogenes, yes, sharing a name with the philosopher, though unrelated, belonged to an 11th century imperial family, and the surname persists in altered forms across the eastern Mediterranean. Monomachos, the name of Constantine IX, one of the more culturally influential Byzantine emperors, also survives in fragmented form among families claiming descent through the female line, since the name itself did not always pass directly to male heirs in later centuries. Now here is where the story stops being simple. Because tracing a surname is not the same as tracing a bloodline, and Byzantine genealogy is layered in ways that resist tidy conclusions. Surnames in the Byzantine world were not always inherited the way modern surnames are. They could be honorific titles adopted by unrelated families who served in the same office. They could pass through marriage into completely different paternal lines. A family could take on the name of a powerful in-law to signal prestige, with no blood connection to the original dynasty at all. This means that when researchers find someone today carrying the name Komnenos or Palaiologos, it does not automatically confirm imperial descent. What it does confirm is something more layered, a documented historical connection to a name that mattered, combined with a genetic thread that may or may not lead all the way back to the throne room. Several explanatory frameworks compete here, and serious researchers are careful not to collapse them into one convenient story. The first is direct paternal descent, an unbroken male line from a documented Byzantine noble to a living person today, potentially confirmed through Y-DNA continuity. The second is adoptive or honorific inheritance, families that took a prestigious name without direct blood ties, meaning the surname survived even where the bloodline did not. The third, and perhaps the most historically revealing, is diffusion through marriage and social absorption, where imperial bloodlines spread not through a single traceable male line, but through daughters, granddaughters, and intermarriage into merchant, clerical, and even peasant families across the empire's former territory. In this model, thousands of people today may carry Byzantine imperial ancestry without carrying the surname at all, while some who carry the surname may have no direct blood connection whatsoever. That asymmetry is uncomfortable. It complicates the neat idea of provable royal descent. But it is also, in its own way, more historically honest than the fantasy version of the story. The most significant recent contribution to this research has not come from a single dramatic discovery, but from the slow accumulation of comparative genealogical databases, Orthodox Church marriage registers digitized across Greece, the Balkans, and the former Venetian territories, cross-referenced against Y-DNA haplogroup studies conducted primarily among Greek, Pontic, and Italo-Greek communities. These studies remain limited in sample size, and researchers are careful to describe their findings as suggestive rather than conclusive. But taken together, they point toward something real, a measurable, non-random concentration of specific paternal lineages among families carrying historically aristocratic Byzantine surnames, compared to the general population in the same regions. That is not the same as saying, if your name is Doukas, you are descended from an emperor. It is saying something more careful, and in some ways more astonishing, that the imperial families of Byzantium did not vanish into myth. Fragments of them can still be statistically detected, scattered across the modern Mediterranean world like sediment from a much older riverbed. And here is the twist that makes this more than a curiosity. Researchers expected, if anything, to find these bloodlines concentrated where you would assume, in Greece, close to the old imperial heartland. What some studies instead suggest is a wider and stranger distribution. Traces appear in southern Italy, where Byzantine administrative culture lingered long after Constantinople's political control ended. They appear in parts of Ukraine and southern Russia, carried by aristocratic marriages between Byzantine and Rus noble houses centuries before the empire's collapse. They even appear, faintly, in Ottoman-era converted families, where a name was changed but oral tradition, and in rare cases, genetic testing, preserved a memory the paperwork tried to erase. The surprise was not that Byzantine bloodlines survived. Empires almost always leave genetic traces behind. The surprise was how far and how quietly they traveled, carried not by armies or coronations, but by ordinary marriages, migrations, and the slow, unglamorous business of families simply continuing to exist. This matters beyond 13 or 14 interesting surnames. It challenges the way we tend to think about the end of empires altogether. We are taught that history moves in clean breaks. An empire falls, a new era begins, the previous world disappears. But genealogy rarely respects those clean lines. Bloodlines do not fall with capitals. They disperse, adapt, marry into new circumstances, and continue, invisibly, inside families who may never look up from their daily lives long enough to wonder where they truly came from. Picture the Peloponnesian countryside in early autumn, where dry hills fall toward a sea the color of hammered metal. Somewhere in a village like this, an old church holds a registry book 2 centuries old, its ink faded to rust, listing marriages between families whose names once belonged to emperors. No one in the village thinks of themselves as descended from Byzantium. They think of themselves as farmers, fishermen, schoolteachers. And yet, in the quiet arithmetic of inherited DNA, something older than memory persists in them, not as a crown, but as a code. That is, in the end, the real discovery here. Not that a handful of people might be secretly royal, but that empire and ordinary life were never as separate as we imagined. The palace and the village were connected all along by threads too small to see with the naked eye, and only now, with genetic tools our ancestors never had, are we able to trace some of those threads back toward the light. Byzantium did not simply fall in 1453. Part of it walked out through the smoke, changed its clothes, married into new families, and kept living under names that sound, to us now, like echoes from a world we assumed was gone. If your surname is one of the 14 mentioned here, that does not guarantee an emperor in your family tree. But it does mean your name once belonged to a world of purple robes and mosaic ceilings, of sieges and coronations, of an empire that lasted over 1,000 years and still, somehow, is not entirely finished with us. The map of who we are has always been more complicated than the names on a passport suggest. Byzantium is a reminder that history does not always end. Sometimes it simply changes its address, and waits, patiently, inside a family tree, for someone to finally ask the right question. If you want more stories where forgotten history hides inside ordinary names and ordinary DNA, let me know in the comments which empire I should trace next.